Harlem, July 7th, 1968. Wells Restaurant on Lenox Avenue, 10:47 p.m. Bumpy Johnson clutched his chest mid-conversation and said something's wrong. He collapsed face first into his dinner plate. He was dead before the ambulance arrived from a massive heart attack. He was 62 years old. The man who had controlled Harlem for 35 years was gone in seconds. 6 days later, Mount Olivet Baptist Church overflowed with 2,000 mourners. Police were everywhere, 50 uniformed officers, plainclothes detectives on rooftops, and photographers documenting faces. They treated it like a surveillance operation because that is what it was. The NYPD wanted to know who would fill the vacuum, who would take over now that Bumpy was dead. Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. delivered the eulogy. He talked about Bumpy's contradictions, criminal and protector, lawbreaker and community defender. He tried to make sense of a man who had operated outside the law, but inside the community's heart. They moved to Woodlawn Cemetery, lowered the casket, said final prayers, and people began dispersing. That's when Stephanie St. Clair stepped forward. The speech took place July 13th, 1968 at 3:47 p.m. Stephanie was 71, retired since the 1940s. Once the Queen of Harlem, she ran the numbers racket, fought Dutch Schultz, and partnered with Bumpy to keep Harlem black-owned and black-controlled. She had lived quietly for decades, protected by Bumpy until his last breath. Now he was gone, and she had something to say. She stood at the graveside. 2,000 people watched, waiting. She began, voice strong despite her age. "Dear people of color, we have fought against discrimination, against police violence, against systems designed to crush us. This man lying here fought those battles with me for 40 years. He protected Harlem when no one else would. He kept this neighborhood ours when powerful forces wanted to take it." She paused, let the weight settle. "But I need you to understand something urgent, something Bumpy knew in his bones. We must unite, must respect each other, must protect each other, because what is coming will destroy us if we do not." Her voice cracked. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered 2 months ago, shot down for demanding our humanity. They killed him anyway. And now Bumpy is gone. The man who preached protection, different methods, same goal, both dead within months. Stephanie looked across the crowd, made eye contact, held attention. "I am 71 years old. I fought battles you will never know. Maybe next year I will join Bumpy in this ground. But before I go, hear me clearly. Young black people, educate yourselves. Fight corruption with intelligence and organization, not just violence. Do not let anyone disrespect you because of your skin color. Stand tall. Demand dignity. Demand equality." Her voice rose. Urgent. Desperate. Prove to America that black lives are equal, not by begging. Be so excellent, so organized, so powerful that equality becomes undeniable. That is what Bumpy wanted. That is what Dr. King died for. She looked down at the casket. Bumpy protected us, but he is gone. I am too old to protect anyone. The protection you need, you must create it yourselves, through education, through unity, through refusing to accept degradation. Final words, barely a whisper but somehow carrying. Unite. Respect each other. Protect each other. Educate yourselves. Fight corruption. Demand dignity. That is Bumpy's legacy. That is what I am begging you to do before I join him here. She placed a flower on the casket. She walked away through the silent crowd. Behind her, 2,000 people nodded, agreed, felt moved by the words. But almost none of them understood what she was really saying. The failure to listen. They heard an inspirational speech, a moving tribute, an elder honoring a fallen leader with calls for unity that sounded good but felt abstract. They did not hear the warning, the prophecy, the desperate plea from someone who saw exactly what was coming and who was using her last public moment to try to prevent it. Stephanie was not giving a speech. She was screaming a warning wrapped in eloquent words. Bumpy's protection is gone. What comes next will destroy you unless you organize now. The drugs coming will devastate this community. The violence will make Bumpy's era look peaceful. Unite immediately, or everything we built will collapse. But they heard that it was nice. Yes, we should be more educated. Yes, we should respect each other. And they went home, continued living as before, made no changes, took no action, missed the urgency completely. A handful, maybe 50 people out of 2,000, understood. They tried to organize. They tried to create community protection systems, but they were overwhelmed. Too few, too late, too much power working against them. 1 year later, on July 14, 1969, Stephanie St. Clair died of heart failure. She died peacefully in her sleep, as if her body knew there was nothing left to fight for. With her death, the last connection to Bumpy's era vanished. She was the last voice with moral authority to warn what was coming. She was the last person who remembered why community protection mattered, and everything she had warned about began happening. The collapse. What came next? The power vacuum from 1968 to 1970. Bumpy's death created immediate chaos. For 35 years, he had been Harlem's unofficial governor. He controlled who operated where. He set rules. He enforced boundaries. He maintained order through a combination of violence, respect, and genuine concern for community welfare. He was not perfect. His system was paternalistic. It limited democracy and it created dependency. But it worked. Under Bumpy, Harlem remained black-controlled. Drugs existed, but they were managed. Violence was controlled. The community functioned. When he died, that structure collapsed instantly. The new generation put profit over people. Frank Lucas, Leroy Nicky Barnes. They were among the men who formed the council, 7 major dealers who divided Harlem between them. These men had grown up admiring Bumpy, but they had learned the wrong lessons. They had seen his power and wanted it, but they had completely missed his sense of responsibility, his understanding that power meant obligation to the community that gave you that power. Lucas flooded Harlem with pure heroin from Southeast Asia. His Blue Magic brand was stronger, cheaper, and bestimmt more addictive than anything available. He made millions, built an empire, and lived in mansions while the community drowned in addiction. Barnes and the council used extreme violence that Bumpy would have considered counterproductive and stupid. Public executions, bodies left in streets as warnings, shootouts that killed bystanders. They ruled through terror, not through the respect Bumpy had cultivated. And critically, devastatingly, they did not care about the community. They did not care about protecting Harlem. They did not care about the destruction they caused. Bumpy had run soup kitchens during the Depression. He had made sure kids could go to school safely. He had kept Harlem black-owned when the mafia wanted to take over. He had understood that his wealth came from the community, so he owed the community protection. Lucas, Barnes, the council, they extracted wealth, destroyed lives, created nothing, protected no one, and cared only about profit. They were purely predatory. Capitalism without conscience, power without responsibility. The heroin epidemic, statistics of destruction. The numbers tell the story of devastation. In 1968, there were an estimated 25,000 heroin addicts in New York City. By 1970, over 100,000. By 1973, estimates reached 200,000 or more. Harlem bore the concentrated impact. Neighborhoods that had been stable, working-class communities became open-air drug markets within months. In 1969, emergency room visits for heroin overdose in Harlem increased 300% from the previous year. From 1970 to 1973, Harlem's infant mortality rate spiked to 32.2 per 1,000 births, double the national average, driven largely by maternal addiction. Property crime exploded. From 1968 to 1972, burglary rates in central Harlem increased 175%. Robbery increased 210%. Addicts were stealing to feed habits that cost $100 to $200 daily. Families collapsed. Children lost parents. Grandparents raised grandchildren while the middle generation disappeared into addiction or incarceration. Entire blocks became uninhabitable as abandoned buildings filled with addicts. This was not a gradual decline. This was sudden, catastrophic collapse. Within 5 years of Bumpy Johnson's death, Harlem transformed from a proud, working-class black community into what news reports called a war zone riddled with criminals and hopeless addicts. The violence epidemic. In 1968, Harlem's homicide rate was 32 per 100,000 residents. By 1972, it reached 87 per 100,000, nearly triple in 4 years. For comparison, the national average was 9 per 100,000. The council and rival organizations fought territorial wars. They used violence as their primary business tool, and they made examples of anyone who challenged them. This created an atmosphere of terror. Young men died. There were over 500 homicides in central Harlem from 1968 to 1973, most drug-related. Most victims were young black men under 30. These were the casualties of the power vacuum that Bumpy's death created. The Rockefeller drug laws, 1973. Mass incarceration begins. Governor Nelson Rockefeller responded to the crisis with the harshest anti-drug laws in American history. Mandatory minimums, life sentences for selling 2 ounces of heroin, 15 years for possession. The laws were designed to stop kingpins like Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes. They failed completely at that goal. Lucas was not arrested until 1975. Barnes was not arrested until 1977. Both were prosecuted federally, not under Rockefeller's state laws. The big operators were too wealthy, too careful, too protected. Instead, the laws caught low-level dealers, users who sold to support their habits, and young black men who were casualties of the epidemic, not its architects. The statistics are devastating. In 1973, New York State prison population was 12,500. By 1980, it was 21,000. By 1990, it was 54,000. By 2000, it was 71,000. Black men were 47% of New York State's prison population, despite being 9% of the state's population. In Harlem specifically, by 1985, over 35% of black men aged 18 to 35 had criminal records. Mass incarceration began. A generation disappeared into prisons. Families were destroyed. Communities were gutted of young men. The cycle became self-perpetuating. Incarceration led to unemployment, which led to poverty, which led to crime, which led to more incarceration. This was the direct consequence of what Stephanie had warned about, the destruction she had begged them to prevent through unity and education and community protection. The long-term devastation, permanent damage. The collapse from 1968 to 1973 caused damage that black communities still have not recovered from 50 years later. Economic destruction. Between 1970 and 1980, Harlem lost 40% of its businesses. Buildings were abandoned, property values collapsed, wealth evaporated, the black middle class fled to the suburbs. Those who remained were trapped in communities with no economic base. Educational collapse. High school graduation rates in central Harlem dropped from 65% in 1968 to 45% by 1975. Schools became overwhelmed by students dealing with trauma and addiction in their families and by violence. College attendance rates plummeted. Family structure. Single-parent households in Harlem increased from 28% in 1968 to 58% by 1980. Not because of culture or values, but because fathers were dead, in prison, or consumed by addiction. Health crisis. By 1990, life expectancy for black men in Harlem was 57 years, lower than Bangladesh and lower than many developing nations. The addiction epidemic, violence, chronic stress, and lack of health care created third-world health outcomes in America's largest city. Intergenerational trauma. Children who grew up in the 1970s in Harlem experienced trauma levels comparable to war zones. Those children became parents in the 1980s and the 1990s, passing trauma to the next generation. The damage compounded across decades. Political disempowerment. As communities collapsed, political organizing became impossible. You cannot organize politically when people are fighting for daily survival. Harlem's political power, significant in the 1950s and the 1960s, evaporated by the 1980s. The bitter mathematics of greed. Here is the calculation that destroyed Harlem. Frank Lucas, at his peak, made an estimated $1 million per day. Nicky Barnes made hundreds of thousands of dollars weekly. The council collectively generated tens of millions of dollars annually. That money came from Harlem, from black families, from addicts paying $100 to $200 daily for heroin. From communities that could barely afford rent, people spent everything on drugs. Lucas lived in a mansion in New Jersey. Barnes drove Cadillacs and wore custom suits. They extracted millions from Harlem while giving nothing back. No soup kitchens, no community programs, no protection, just pure extraction. Compare that to Bumpy's era. He made money from the numbers, yes, but he also fed people during the Depression, protected businesses from takeover, and made sure kids could go to school safely. He maintained order that allowed normal life to continue. The profit motive was the same, but Bumpy understood community sustainability. He understood you could not extract everything without destroying the base that generated your wealth. He understood obligation. Lucas, Barnes, and the council understood only profit. They would turn Harlem into a wasteland if it meant getting richer, and they did exactly that. By the time they were arrested in the mid-1970s, they had made tens of millions of dollars. They left behind a community so devastated it still has not fully recovered. That is what profit-driven drug dealing looks like without community protection. That is what happens when criminals care only about wealth and nothing about the people they are extracting that wealth from. That is what Stephanie tried to warn about. The predatory capitalism that replaced Bumpy's paternalistic protection, the destruction pure profit motive causes when unleashed on vulnerable communities. The worsening situation led to political response. Governor Nelson Rockefeller pushed through some of the toughest anti-drug laws in American history in 1973. Mandatory minimum sentences and harsh penalties were imposed even for possession. The laws were designed to stop kingpins like Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes. The laws did not stop the kingpins. They were too wealthy, too protected, and too careful. Instead, the laws caught low-level dealers, users, people addicted who sold to support their habits, and young black men who were casualties of the addiction crisis rather than its architects. Mass incarceration began. Thousands of black men were sent to prison for decades. Families were destroyed. Communities were gutted of their young men. A generation was lost to prison, instead of having opportunities to build better futures. The very thing Stephanie warned about, the destruction of the Black community through drugs and violence and failed responses, happened exactly as she had predicted. The community never recovered. Not really. Not in the way Stephanie and Bumpy had known it. The Harlem of 1968, imperfect and compromised but protective of its people, was gone. It was replaced by a Harlem of addiction, violence, incarceration, and despair. The informal protection Bumpy had provided, flawed but real, was replaced by predatory exploitation, by dealers who lived in the community but did not care about it. They extracted wealth without giving anything back. They destroyed lives without conscience. The unity Stephanie had begged for never materialized. Instead, the community fractured, divided between addicts and non-addicts, between criminals and civilians, between those trying to build and those tearing down. The education she had demanded did not happen fast enough or broadly enough to counter the destruction. Young people who might have been the next generation of leaders became casualties of addiction or incarceration instead. The equality she said they needed to prove became impossible when the community was fighting for survival rather than advancement. Everything she had warned about came true. Every prediction, every fear, every desperate plea in that cemetery speech. And almost no one listened closely enough to prevent it. She said it clearly, explicitly, not in coded language or subtle hints. A direct warning: unite, educate yourselves, protect each other, fight corruption. Otherwise, everything we built will be destroyed. But warnings only work if people listen, if they understand the urgency, if they act on what they hear. Most people heard her speech as a nice tribute, moving words from an older woman honoring her friend. They nodded. They agreed in principle. They went home and continued living as they always had. A few people understood and tried to organize, tried to create the unity she demanded. But they were overwhelmed. Too few people, too late, too much power against them. And so it happened. Everything she had feared, everything she had warned against, the destruction of Harlem, the addiction crisis, the violence, the mass incarceration, the generational trauma that Black communities are still recovering from 50 years later, all of it predictable, all of it preventable, all of it ignored until it was too late. That was July 1968, the day Bumpy Johnson was buried, the day Stephanie St. Clair delivered the most important speech of her life, the day she tried to save a community by warning them what was coming, and the day almost everyone failed to listen. What Stephanie St. Clair said at Bumpy Johnson's funeral should have changed the fate of Black people forever, should have united them against the destruction she predicted, should have organized them to protect themselves when their protector was gone. Instead, it became a footnote, a moving speech people remembered for its eloquence, but not for its warning. A prophecy ignored until every word came true. That is the tragedy. Not that Bumpy died, not that Stephanie died, but that they tried to warn everyone what was coming, tried to prepare the community to survive without them, tried to pass on the knowledge and the urgency and the responsibility. And almost everyone heard the words, but missed the message. By the time people understood, it was too late. The damage was done. The community was broken. The destruction was complete. And Stephanie's desperate plea, unite, educate, protect each other, echoed across decades as the warning no one heeded, the wisdom no one followed, the last chance that slipped away while everyone nodded and agreed, but did not act. That was what she said at Bumpy's funeral. That was what should have changed everything. That was what might have saved a community if anyone had truly listened. But they did not. And everything she feared came to pass.